All right, I think we're ready to go. All right, so welcome everybody. This is episode 20 of Storycomic Presents, and we have with us Dan Barlow and Andy Kolovos, who are proclaimed Archie experts. I won't say who proclaimed that is. So Archie comic experts. And I gotta say, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. And to give it some background as well, is that really when it was a couple of years ago when so Dan and Andy, you guys are in charge of the old guys in comics, the panel to panel, which was the host the swap thing.
Panel to Panel is the Facebook group that we're both admins for. And
okay.
We're also all wrapped up in the swap thing.
The swap
thing.
Is that a Voltron mug?
This is my
oh, He-Man.
He-Man and She-Ra Pride mug. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Isn't that cool? And I remember we were there and I remember everybody's there, comic books and everything like that. And I've always been a fan of, the Bronze Age Marvel and DC comics. And I remember the two of you were combing over everybody's boxes looking for Archie comics, and it blew my mind because I have never in my history of comic book collecting ever met people somewhat rabid fans of Archie comics. And that's why I said I gotta figure out what is up with this. Like, what is up with there's that with the Archie piece. And so when I started doing this program, I decided that one of the first things I asked was that both of you to say, hey, can you come on and talk about Archie? And both of you said absolutely. So here we are, almost 6 months later. So without further ado, I want to just kind of open it up and have both of you kind of introduce yourselves and kind of give yourselves a little bit of background before we dive right into talking about Archie Comics. So, Andy, you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, I'm Andy Kolovos, resident of the village of Essex Junction, lifelong comics fan. I also, my day gig is the Vermont Folklife Center, where I'm the associate director and archivist. How's that?
Good. Yeah.
And I'm Dan Barlow. I live in Berry City, Vermont, and my day job is as the director of a national business group organizing businesses around Medicare for All. And I've been reading Archie comics since I was a little kid, buying the digest at the supermarket in the 1980s.
So let's start off with Andy. Give us a background on what made you start getting into the history and just really diving into Archie comics.
Well, Archie was something that was always around when I was a kid, and I'm going to be 49 tomorrow. So, like mid 70s, and in my head, like they had an odd kind of aura of being less desirable than superhero comics, but I certainly read them from time to time. And I have this vivid memory of being really excited. We had an attic in our garage, and going up there and finding like this comic and seeing in the distance this sort of ragged comic book and wondering what could that be, and discovering it was like a Josie and the Pussycats and being kind of let down. But like my interest in Archie probably in the 80s, as a teenager, like I began to develop an ironic interest in it. One of the catalysts even for a non-ironic interest, and I'll just pull out the prop, is this is not my original copy. My original copy became really ragged, but this is a magazine that no longer exists, Comics Collector. And I was visiting my grandmother in the summer of 1985 and was obsessed with ElfQuest. So did some yard work for her, and she reluctantly purchased this from me. But in it was a whole great color article about Archie and about old Archies and about how cheap they were. So back in 85, so I looked at the pictures and we're just like, this artwork is stunning. And I became kind of obsessed with Bob Montana, the guy who created the characters, and other artists here. I couldn't really identify the others, So I grew up on Long Island in the New York area and would go to Comic Cons in high school every once in a while when I had money. And I would ask people, you have any old Archie comics? And it was astonishingly hard to find them. And, but like, I would always go to the most, and I still do this, like I'd go to the most ragged, cheap ones and buy them, And I bought them. I liked them. I even at the Archie booth at one of these cons, I picked up an Archie fan club pin that I used to ironically wear on my jean jacket, my painted jean rock and roll jean jacket. So there was this sort of like latent interest that had built up and then just kind of went into stasis. And then I don't know, really. It was after I got involved with Panel to Panel and became friends with Dan and the other admins, and something was in the air. Like it's one of these sort of zeitgeist things, I think, where either we're victims of very subtle marketing, and we're picking up on whatever they want us to pick up on. But I was like, Archie. And like Dan was getting into them, and Cole was getting into them, and John Robnack, the founder of Panel to Panel, was not getting into them. Wagoner became. We started the Facebook group called the Vermont Adult Onset Archie Fan Club. So I developed this interest later in life, and then really got kind of obsessed with a particular artist named Harry Lucy, who is my absolute favorite of the Archie artists, and primarily in part inspired by who wrote the book, Dan? 12 Cent Archie.
Bart Biddy.
Bart Biddy's book, the 12 Cent Archie, which is just a fabulous book that is both written in the style of an Archie comic, in that you could pick it up at any chapter. There's really no coherence. It's a nonlinear book because Archie is fundamentally nonlinear outside of each episode. And all that stuff kind of compounded my interest in it over time. And then I began to obsessively buy them. And even like 5 years ago, is that when we started this shit?
Yeah.
They were still remarkably cheap. So anyway, I'll pass the baton to Dan.
And interesting, I think like a reoccurring theme we keep on coming back to is Archie comics as disposable entertainment.
Yeah.
More so than comics were considered as disposable entertainment back in like the 40s to 50s and 60s, before the collector era really kicked in. And that really ties into kind of like how the company always approached this line of comics. It'd have the main Archie comic, it had Pep and Laugh, its historical legend titles, and then, a myriad of other Archie related titles where one story that appeared in one title, 2 or 3 months later could then appear in another title again. And they would just assume the audience wouldn't even notice because it was considered disposable entertainment, like more so than even like Batman or Superman at the time. That this is something that you read and then you passed on. And, now I'm here, I'm 41 years old and I'm like hoarding Archie comics. I probably have 1,000 plus, must be more than that maybe, 8 long boxes of Archie comics. And, as Andy said, I don't know if it was the spirit guide guiding all of our brains at the same time, but I was, desperate for this feeling of nostalgia from my youth of reading the Archie comics. I mean, I read them as a preteen, and they totally warped my mind of what I thought my adolescence would be. I thought I'd be at the beach a lot, and there'd be a lot of like bikini like contests I'd be judging. That never happened. And so, this sense of nostalgia, but also recognizing for me, the big appeal was realizing that they just had, as a company, some of the most like creative, zany, talented cartoonists working for them without the ability to sign their name to their work. Dan DeCarlo, Harry Lucy, Sam Schwartz, Bob Montana, a vast majority of their work for Archie Comics. Fans recognized their style, but they went uncredited. And really, they were just doing revolutionary things with some really simple tools of what was allowed within an Archie comic.
So take us back a bit. So for those that are listening or watching that said, "Oh yeah, I've heard of Archie before, but why? So what's the big deal?" So, but let's take it back first from the historical perspective of when did it start? It wasn't always called Archie Comics as a publisher, and it's been around for a little over almost 80 years now. So you want to give us kind of like the genesis of where Archie first came from?
Sure. I mean, the company, it was MLJ Publications, started publishing comics in 1939. At the time, it was standard superhero fare, this kind of stuff that a lot of comic publishers were putting out at the time. And these were anthology titles usually. So like, one story by one superhero, and then maybe there's a romance story and they'll toss in another genre. And then they had this one comic called Pep Comics, and in Pep Comics number 22, which came out at the tail end of 1941, it introduced Archie Andrews. And that just kind of changed the face of that company forever. This was, this could have been a throwaway one or two issue story with these characters, but it really resonated with the audience. And quite frankly, at the time, they were basing the Andy Hardy movies were really popular, the one starring Mickey Rooney. I confess I've never actually seen them, but I probably should. And there was a lot of inspiration that they pulled, from that within pop culture. But what I think really the reason it resonated with is that Bob Montana, the original cartoonist and co-creator of these characters, for him, he really based these experiences and these characters on people he knew growing up in Massachusetts. So it's a deeply, it's a simple comic, but I feel like it has so much authenticity in it. And really the central point of the comic was the love triangle between Archie Andrews, Betty Cooper, and Veronica Lodge.
Okay. And so it was out, and then it was that point when when did they lose the that title and then just become Archie Comics as a publisher?
Yeah, Archie #1, I think, came out in 1942. They realized very quickly that this was a popular strip. And then Archie eventually just took over, the Pep title as well. He wasn't on the cover for a little bit, but eventually he kicked off all the superheroes and became the cover title too. And then what you saw was just years of mass media building. And the thing about Archie Comics is that they have always been like so shameless in seeking the next big seller. And they've always been so eager to have Archie appear across media platforms. So, in the 1950s, there's an Archie radio show. And then you got into the 1960s and the Archie cartoons. And then the band and the records came out. They were just so willing to do whatever it took to get these characters in front of a mass audience.
It was because that was my other question is like, there is a graveyard full of public publishers. You got Fawcett Comics, you got Charleston Comics, you got Fiction House. There's a lot of comic book publishers that we either amalgamated that were bought out by Marvel or DC, but for some reason Archie has always been that quiet third publisher that no one's really paid attention to, but has always been very good. Is that what you say when you mentioned earlier about these parts where they did TV shows and cartoons at that point was it like the late early 60s or around that time?
Yeah, late 1960s was the cartoons, and then the Archies as a band, and they had started putting out records. And I think injecting themselves into other media has been so key to the long-term success of Archie. We're talking about a company and a character that's been around 80 years now, and probably Batman, Superman, a handful of others are up there. And again, there's a reason why they continue to exist, because the companies have been smart about how they use them, but also ultimately I think there's something that resonates about these characters.
Now, so let me ask Andy this. Andy, do you have we have the Archie universe there, the Archie, but so it started off as having the superheroes, but now because there are some other titles other than Archie itself. There's other characters that people might be familiar with.
Or not familiar with at all. I mean, like Wilbur, I got a Wilbur, and I don't know what Archie was thinking in their marketing. Like, hey, let's just throw it out there and see if it sticks. From a collector standpoint, old Wilburs are a lot cheaper than old Archies because nobody wants them, but that Wilkin boy. Yeah, and it's like, I guess part of the question is, and this builds off what Dan was saying, is, what characters do we remember? And for me, like, I grew up with that cartoon in reruns and the Sabrina cartoon at different points in my childhood. Like, I'm not old enough to have remembered it when it came out. And the persistent characters are the ones that were put in front of us. I think the Archie's band thing that Dan pointed out is pretty significant because, the song Sugar Sugar, I don't know what the performers actually look like. but I can picture the album cover, which is the Archies from the comic.
Yeah.
But as far as the other stuff, I'm sorry, Dan, I can.
No, please.
That the superheroes and other components of other Archie properties, they would emerge periodically, and furthermore, this may be getting off the track a bit, but one of the other things they were pretty good at was trying to forgive the word, but leverage the popularity of the characters by having them embrace whatever the fad happened to be at any particular moment. So, like in the '60s, there are both superhero Archie comics, and that use the Archie characters. Jughead was Captain Hero, Betty was Super Teen, and also a whole run of, say, the book Life with Archie that was spies, that was all 007. When monsters became cool, they launched the Madhouse title and would put Frankenstein's monster on the cover or an alien on the cover. So anyway, I'll pass the baton because I'll just start rambling.
And to build on what Andy said, they built Archie into this mini empire because there's not just the Archie book, there's Pep, there's Laugh, there is Archie and Me, Everything's Archie, The World of Archie, Archie at Riverdale High, Betty and Veronica, Jughead, Reggie and Me. They built out this empire, and Andy's right. I mean, there's all these franchises you've never heard of because they failed, like that Wilkin boy who I think ran about 40 issues in the 1970s. But we don't, we recognize Archie. Betty and Veronica are also huge cultural icons, but they also landed with Josie and the Pussycats and Sabrina and the Teenage Witch. I mean, for a company like this and those were properties introduced in the mid 1960s, early 1960s. And that was decades after they had already spent developing Archie and the Riverdale Gang. So it's really astonishing. Again, there's just something about the simplicity of the concept. But again, I have to keep on coming back to the talent they hired, the talent that for the most part, was when unacknowledged at the time.
I have a question for Dan, actually, because one of the things he brings up, and this relates to your question, Barney, is that, Josie is an example of a character they introduced. She had her own book. And there's continuity between the Josie book and the Archie book, right? They overlap in the beginning, or are they totally separate, Dan?
They first interact in issue 9 of the Josie title.
And then Josie, because of astute marketing, became something that I knew because of Josie and the Pussycats and because that cartoon was on in reruns when I was a kid. And I remember vividly, I never wanted to go to church and it was always on right before church kind of thing, so it was like, I'm going to watch Josie and then this is bittersweet because after it's over, I got to get in the car. But that line of Josie and Sabrina too, where they were tangential to the mass, but for one reason or another, they merged them, and that merging, one of the jokes we have so the panel to panel group on Facebook was started by John Ravnak, and we just share pictures of panels. And some of my favorite panels are like the crossover panels with Archie, where it's like, oh look, there's Josie and Sabrina. And they're eating pizza with Jughead or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fact that this is it's like the early version of the extended Marvel universe, where Spider-Man and the Avengers could hang out. Where Sabrina sometimes goes to Riverdale High, but sometimes she also lives in Greendale, which is just the town next door to Riverdale. So even there are times when that Wilkin boy when he'll show up, so these all exist within the same universe. What's fascinating is it does seem like, for the most part, none of these characters age. None of them really change for the most part. There'll be soft relaunches every decade or so of different, aspects of their personality. But they just move through time unaged. It's almost this eternal, life as a 16-year-old that's occurring, in peak summer half the time. It's this idealized version, I think, of what everyone wanted, almost as a perfect, teenage years. And that format allows Archie to become a lens which you can see 80 years of American history through, because depending on how they slightly alter that character or the storylines they're involved with.
I'm just making a note before I forget something. 'Cause it's, yeah. And that's part of the fun, like Dan and I have talked a lot about this. Like I read and enjoy a lot of romance comics, and particularly romance comics from the late 60s through the mid 70s, because romance comics had no choice but to address the women's movement if they were going to even pretend to stay relevant, and Archie struggled with the same thing, and I think, like some of my favorites, and I think some of Dan's favorites too, Archie stories are the ones that deal with the women's movement and how, a bunch of weird middle-aged dudes try to make sense of it using these characters. It's one of the things I find totally fascinating.
And
so your friend Cole he asked the question, can you guys talk about the socio-political viewpoint of the Archie comics over the years? I'm fascinated by what seemed like an underlying amused reactionary stance of the creators when it comes to mining teen fads and interest for plots and comedy.
I mean, yeah.
One aspect I think that you can't ignore about the Archie comics is fashion. And fashion has always been like a central part, especially once the Betty and Veronica title started in the late 1950s. And I think, that ran all the way, for decades. And especially in the 1960s, the Dan DeCarlo era of the Betty and Veronica book, fashion was just part of the image. And it was really, they would pull from, what kids were wearing, what the magazines were printing at the time. And they would have, full page splash pages of fashion layouts of Betty and Veronica in different fashions. And that even developed into a theme later on where they had readers send in fashion designs and they would have Dan DeCarlo draw Betty and Veronica in those fashions. I actually just met someone online the other day in one of the Archie groups who was one of the people who suggested a dress or something that Betty wore and posted like his letter and then what DeCarlo ended up drawing. I honestly thought that was fake for a long time. But fashion's been such a central part of the comic. And Andy's right. I mean, they've struggled. They love grabbing pop culture and using pop culture as much as it can. When it comes to actual like social political issues, the company has always really struggled. It wasn't until Valerie from Josie and the Pussycats was the first major Black character that this was a white comic for decades, a white with middle class families living in average America. It's like David Lynch's America, where it's perpetually the 1950s. And then again, it wasn't until 1971 that they introduced Chuck Clayton, who was like the first regular Black member of the Archie cast. And he's never had his own comic, over the years either. They've really struggled with bringing on diversity, especially during the 1960s and 70s, when a lot of companies were, diversifying what their comics looked like, and at the very least, introducing some Black heroes into their comics. But Archie really they dragged their feet on a lot of these things, especially during such a disruptive and important time in American history.
Yeah, I mean, when Dan and I, with Robin Smith, the cartoonist and CCS graduate, did a presentation for Steve Bissett in his class, as one of his last classes at CCS, and that we led with that notion that Riverdale is a almost exclusively white place, and so like me as a white kid growing up in the suburbs that were pretty white could totally relate to it, like that was just normal. And it wasn't until I was an adult where I'm like, wait a minute. Hold on, wait, I got to think about this differently. But to go back to Cole's question, I mean, like on some level, like that sort of stuff is the seedbed of all adult comedy that uses kid characters. Like, I mean, Archie was basically, portrayed as like, a pre-hot rodder, like almost like a raccoon, like a raccoon coat wearing, like ukulele playing gag from the 20s in the beginning, so that mining those bits of things that don't make sense to adults and they find ridiculous. I mean, and fashion as an example too. I'm thinking, Dan, you remember that like that episode where they're like, oh my God, I think Betty's become a hippie.
Yes.
You know, and it's because of how she's dressing and what she's doing. And it turns out, no, Betty's not a hippie. Don't worry. But you know, like it's a huge source of anxiety for the whole gang. So the question is, who's anxious?
Yes.
You know, Goldman anxious, the artist anxious, the writer anxious. Who's anxious about this? Or are they not anxious and they're playing a game?
And it's actually quite a mystery, Andy, like kind of why this company, was behind the times back then. There's certainly it's a different company today with Kevin Keller, major gay character introduced more than 10 years ago. But I do keep on coming back, like in the old Archie Comics, especially the ones from the 1950s. This was a company that advertised itself as wholesome and quality comics that are appropriate for the whole family. And so right out the gate, I think there's this real conservative mindset about what the characters are and what the company is. And that, took a long time to really change. And it took the world around it changing faster before the internal Riverdale world could change.
Well, and I think, Dan, that's actually like a fabulous point too, because the other component, which we discussed a bit earlier, was the role of Archie in the establishment of the comics code. And in a way, you could say that their role there was doubling down, right, on the maintenance of this kind of status quo. As perhaps, I mean, I think it's a little hyperbolic, but to say like as the world, as John Goldman sees the world falling apart around him, juvenile delinquency. Catholics and Protestants marrying, my God, that they were able to control the world and sort of essentially create a nostalgic space in the midst of a cultural transition.
Yeah. And Andy, do you want to just quickly explain what the Comics Code was?
Sure, Dan. So for the viewers who may not be aware, back in the 1950s, one of the most successful types of comics out there were horror comics, and EC Comics is probably the most famous. And based on my wide reading over the pandemic, over the COVID lockdown period, hands down the best publishers of this sort of stuff. But there were people who were churning it out. Even Atlas, even pre-Marvel, was churning these out, and Charlton was churning them out, and somewhere along the line, a psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham was working with children, and what he noticed was that a lot of these troubled kids that he worked with read comic books, and he developed a causal relationship between the reading of comic books and juvenile delinquency, which was the term of the period for kids acting out, So he published a book called Seduction of the Innocent that focused, interestingly, I would say, most of the examples in there are crime comics, or not horror, but crime comics, horror comics. It was like these crime comics, they're basically teaching children how to commit crimes. These horror comics, good Lord, the content, and some of it really, it's like some of it I won't let my kids read. Honestly, like I'm that kind of parent at 10, 11, 12, maybe 12, I'll let them read it. So this book became a cause célèbre around people who were trying to come to terms with all of the post-war transition in American culture, trying to get a handle on it, trying to scapegoat a rationale for the problem, and ultimately this focus on comic books. Like my impression is that Wortham was basically like the talk show star of the day. This book was a book club selection. I own a copy of it that was a book club edition, and because he rallied, and the stereotype is this army of mothers, there were comic book burnings, there were Senate hearings, and the industry sort of realized that they were having a problem. And that problem was either we have to fix this or it's going to get fixed for us, and we're probably not going to like that. So the major publishers, with Archie as one of the leads, sort of circled the wagons and kept EC on the outside and crafted a body, a self-censorship body, and a series of guidelines for what was appropriate to appear in a comic book. And the early versions of the code highlighted things like, you cannot use the word horror or terror or in the title, The Walking Dead, or just, so basically it was like a tick box of everything that EC was successful with. So and Archie was at the forefront of this, in part because they had nothing to lose. and in fact, they could come out of it looking like heroes, right? We've always been decent, and hey, we are the agents of decency.
So was that decision that they made? Was that a marketing? Was that marketing reason, or is that like an economic reason to do that, to almost, as you say, to prevent anything happening to their publications?
Well, I mean, I think it was designed in an inverse way that had that effect, right? It's let's make everything that we don't do a problem. I mean, I don't know the detail well enough to be able to say, but my impression is that it's no accident, that this was about cutting out competition as much as about saving a livelihood, right? Because comics were just going to go away. So the exchange was, that seal that you see on all comics that it says approved by the Comic Code Authority. So any book that met these guidelines, or comics, were sent to the code to review. Sometimes the code censors would say you have to change this panel or that panel or get rid of that word. And once approved, they would be able to carry the seal, which from the newsstand perspective and arguably from the parent perspective meant they were safe for your kid to read.
And Andy, the Comics Code was that 1954, right?
I believe that's when it was established. Yeah, and there's a funny thing, and this is, I don't know if it's like, I kind of believe it, but I haven't been careful and I haven't been thorough in my analysis. But a company called PS Art Books, this British publisher, has been churning out some excellent and some not so excellent reprints of pre-code horror. And as you get closer to that deadline, they get more and more garish. It's like they're just pulling out the stops by the end.
And what I think is really interesting about the role of Archie Comics and John Goldwater in all these proceedings is it was a moment there. If you go through the history there, it was not Archie Comics that were being burned across the country. They were actually being highlighted by the social conservative activists campaigning against comics as wholesome comics, as the right comics to read. And so right away, Archie Comics as a company found themselves on, quote unquote, the right side of this battle, the winning side of this battle where the momentum was. And yes, this has always been a company that has been fiercely protective of both its intellectual property, but also completely shameless in how much money it makes and how successful it wants to be. So I think there's a good case to be made that they saw this as an opportunity to clear the field of a whole bunch of competitors and promote Archie Comics as the comics that kids should be reading. And the irony of all this is that the Comics Code in 1954 put all those horror and crime comics out of print, and it ended up kicking off probably the most creative 15 years that Archie Comics has had in the history of its publication.
So
yeah,
it could be
that, yeah.
So in that case, since they weren't being targeted, do you see this more as Machiavellian or self-preservation for them to really grab a hold of creating the Comics Code?
Both, I'd say, but Dan?
I mean, I would say Goldwater always struck me as a short-term thinker,
Okay.
not a big strategy guy.
Yeah. There was another point I was going to make, but I forgot. I can't remember what I was going to say.
So post Comic Code, was at that point then that really, as you said, Archie Comics exploded in popularity.
Yeah, I mean, you had, in the 1950s, you had the Archie radio show, and then just creatively, between 1955 and 1960, really, the best cartoonists started working for Archie Comics, and they all kind of ended up on the right properties. So you had, Bob Montana, who was the original creator, went off to start doing the Archie newspaper strip. And at that point had honed his style to a point that is, the iconic style we all recognize now. You had Dan DeCarlo launching the Betty and Veronica title, which sold almost as much as the main Archie title. And then you had Harry Lucy, who started doing the Archie title, and then Sam Schwartz on the Jughead title. And for some of these cartoonists, this was the start of decades of a relationship with these characters.
As you mentioned earlier before we went on air, that there was there was, as you said, there's a lot of artists and writers that got their start there. Did they utilize Archie Comics as a springboarding opportunity to go into other comic books from other industries, or was it that Archie Comics was just more accessible for new writers and artists, and the larger companies were harder to get into?
You know, I've always got the sense that even when Archie Comics were selling, 500,000 copies a month across the country, it was still considered low on the totem pole within the comics industry. That working for a DC title or a Marvel title was much more appealing, even before the superhero boom, took off in 1962, 63. So I've always got the sense that, like, it's either where you start or it's where you end up late in your career. But clearly, Archie, took care of some of these cartoonists, Dan DeCarlo and Harry Lucy and Sam Schwartz. They stayed with that company for decades. And, they also did other work. Dan DeCarlo worked with Stan Lee at Marvel on a comic strip over there. And Sam Schwartz had left in the late 1960s to go do some other teen romance comics. But they all find their way back to Archie at some point.
Yeah, and Lucy too, because he worked for Tower on Tippy.
Yep.
And Go-Go. But yeah, and to go back to something Dan was saying earlier, and those three guys as examples, that period that we're talking about is where the Archie we know now became codified. And it was codified by the work of these specific artists. DeCarlo. It's like, you can say this is quintessentially Archie when you look at DeCarlo, and like DeCarlo is sort of the guy, to me, upon whom the house style that perpetuated into the 90s is rooted.
Was there at any parts where you would consider also that the Archie Comics, as because we've talked about how it's been conservative, being kind of the last ones to the show. Has there been any examples that you would give where Archie Comics as a publisher were innovative in their approaches compared to other publishers?
I mean, to me, and I'll, this is really like 80s Archie is where I lose interest, just as a reader and a collector. But like, to go back to a point Dan made earlier, it's ingenious marketing, Archie versus Predator, which they knew was ridiculous, and everyone who bought it knew was ridiculous. But to me, and I don't know if there are precedents to that, Dan, but like, that's kind of like a watershed, right? Where the Archie we have now, if we want to create a watershed moment of transition, the Archie we have now kind of began there, but also Kevin, the introducing a gay character is, because was that in the 90s, Dan?
It was actually in 2010.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, no, they're late to that party, but I
mean, still before, correct me if I'm wrong, before, SCOTUS made the marriage equality decision, this was a company that, like, even at that point in 2010, coming out with a gay character, not only coming out with a gay character, but actually giving that gay character their own ongoing title. Which was huge, again, which they never did for any of their black characters like Clayton, Chuck Clayton. But that was still a big moment for Archie Comics, and I think a moment where they also had reinvented themselves. But I think, one thing they did do, and again, they did do really right, was back in the 1970s, start those the reprint digests, the smaller digest. You see them in the supermarket. They, as comics were really moving into the specialty stores, they were trying to get onto the newsstands and supermarkets and have their products in front of kids. And those, reduced size reprint, those are mostly reprints. Maybe there was like one new story to lead it off, but the rest of it was reprints. So it was incredibly inexpensive for them to produce these things from a standpoint of the material. But, these things sold, hundreds of thousands of copies every month. And there was a reason that Archie, continued into the next few decades. I know it's how I, found them.
Yeah, no, totally.
So talk to us a bit about, as well as that they actually kind of started doing some franchising. I think we talked about earlier about going off and working, and we mentioned earlier that Spire Christian Comics and started going off. So was that part of that marketing? Is that talk to us a little bit about that part that Archie Comics did?
So yeah, I can. This is my specialty. In the late 1960s, this cartoonist named Al Hartley, he had spent already decades in the comics industry. He worked with Stan Lee. He drew a whole bunch of fashion and romance and teen comics for different publishers for decades. In the late 1960s, he found himself, literally at the end of a rope. It sounds like near suicide, and he had a religious conversion, became a born-again Christian. Around the same time, he was drawing a softcore pornographic comic called The Adventures of Pussycat. At the time, he quit that, and he's like, I'm putting my life in God's hands. And a week later, Archie Comics comes calling and says, do you want some work? And, I said earlier that for some people, Archie is the start of their career. Archie was the end of Al Hartley's career. He had already spent 3 decades in comics. He was a seasoned pro who had already worked for everyone else. So he went to start drawing Archie Comics and instantly saw this as an opportunity, that God had given him an opportunity to use Archie as a franchise to proselytize Christianity to people around the world. Archie Comics right away told him to clamp down on the Jesus stuff because he had some really overt references in some of his early stories, and he got a little subtler with them. But what's really fascinating is Al Hartley, for some reason, Dan DeCarlo, Harry Lucy, they all worked with writers, mostly Frank Doyle. Al Hartley was allowed to write and draw his own Archie Comics, and I can't quite figure out how he got that special relationship. But that's something that very few of the other Archie comic cartoonists were allowed to do. And he, meanwhile, hooked up with Spire Publishing. They had done a lot of Christian books. They actually been around for 68 years or so, and wanted to get into comics. And he started doing some adaptations of Christian memoirs by popular Christian mainstream writers at the time. And those were really successful. And then he actually went to Goldwater, the publisher of Archie at the time, and pitched him on the idea of a series of Archie comics for Spire Comics that would focus on the cast as their faith in God and Jesus. And what's really fascinating again is, like, you have Al Hartley, born again Christian on one side, John Goldwater, who was Jewish on the other, and he signs away the rights to his characters to become Christian propaganda. Some of these comics that Al Hartley did were early 1970s, kind of feel good, everyone love each other, warm and fuzzy, moral tales, which I think are unoffensive to anyone. But in several of them, he really engages in a lot of the, the social battles and the cultural battles that religious conservatives were waging at the time around prayer in school, abortion rights, segregation at times. So you really have some extreme views represented in some of these Archie comics that were co-published or actually published entirely by Spire. And the thing about these, Al Hartley did 19 Archie comics for Spire, and these things were just printed and reprinted. So there's millions of copies out there. So when you go dumpster, dollar bin diving for Archie comics, you're going to find some of these Spires in there for $1. And it's a weird glimpse into a very strange part of Archie history.
Yeah, Dan, have you completed your collection of Spires yet?
I'm still missing that Christmas one that for some reason is really, really rare and sells for $150 on eBay.
Hear that, fans? That's what Dan's looking for.
Yes. Start the Kickstarter, please.
It's more of a GoFundMe page than a Kickstarter.
Yeah, the kickstarting the reprint of it is.
So a lot of the listeners and viewers are going to be very familiar to this new evolution of Archie Comics with the Chilling Tales of Sabrina on Netflix, and also Riverdale on the CW. So explain to us a little bit about how that transition happened for Archie Comics.
Andy, do you want to jump in here at
I mean,
all?
this is your world, man. Like this stuff, because like I only like old comics. You know, I'm like a snob that way. And I like Sabrina, I dig, and the new Sabrina comic, I dig. But I guess, and this is, you know, so Dan, I said I wasn't going to say anything, but I'm gonna. You know, so to me, this issue of like Archie and the Predator, Archie and the Punisher, right, is this, to me, this watershed moment, because the genius that erupted was whoever greenlighted the Archie horror book, what the hell was it called, the zombie one,
Archie?
Afterlife with Archie. You know, because that allowed for, I think, a massive reframing. You know, it was kitsch, and that was part of the charm, I think, and part of the marketing, but it was also pretty solid in itself, and it played to the fan. You know, like if you know anything about Jughead, you know anything about Hot Dog, like suddenly you understand, you know. So like to me, that was the next step in the evolution of this, like broadening the appeal, drawing in different types of fans, and then cultivating those fans. But Dan is really way more familiar with this stuff than I am.
Yeah, so it comes back down to this writer named Roberto Aguirre Sacasa, who you know, he'd written a few comics here and there. Interestingly enough, you know, he actually had an off-Broadway play that was about Archie coming out of the closet as a gay man, and Archie Comics actually, you know, got that production shut down, and through some strange series of events, he ended up, you know, back in contact with Archie, and in 2013 launching the title Afterlife with Archie, which is a play on the title Life with Archie. And this was What If Zombies Attacked Riverdale? And it had just fantastic art. And some strong writing. Roberto is quite the writer. And that was followed up a year or two later with The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, his other title with Robert Hack, the cartoonist. And, you know, it's so fascinating because these were the type of comics that would have been shut down by the Comics Code in 1954. I mean, they are gory, they are violent, it's visceral stuff. You know, especially the Sabrina book, you know, I mean, like, devil and Satanism and satanic rites, it's all in there. It's like an old Hammer horror film. And these books were just not only were huge sellers, but they got folks like me back into Archie Comics. You know, this was an element that brought me back into Archie the world, because it was that same, you know, dissonance between, okay, it's Archie, but it's also real horror. You know, the same way that something like Archie versus the Punisher or Archie versus Predator really mind as well.
Yeah, and this is to go back to where we started here, you know, because I have to work linearly, like as Dan said, like talk about the zeitgeist. Like this was that thing, I think, that got me thinking about Archie again, you know, like, and I was like, what the hell are they doing? You know, and then I actually found a copy of the trade of Afterlife with Archie at Barnes & Noble in South Burlington on sale, used, and was blown away. I mean, I'll give you the spoiler, you know, how it starts. It's like, you know, Jughead has this dog named Hot Dog. Jughead loves Hot Dog. Hot Dog gets hit by a car and killed. Jughead begs Sabrina to bring him back to life. And then everything cascades from there. And I'm like, this is brilliant. This is absolutely brilliant. And reading that, I was like, you know, I should be reading Archie comics again. I got all those. I still have all the ones I bought back in the 80s and 90s, you know, in a box upstairs. So, yeah.
Yeah. And then, you know, once Roberto Aguirre Sacasa, you know, was writing these comics for Archie, he was a guy who also had a TV background. I think he was one of the producers on Glee before he started writing the comics for Archie. Right away, he started mining these opportunities to bring Archie back to TV. And that ended up with you know, both the Riverdale show on the CW, which you mentioned, Barney, and Chilling Adventures of Sabrina on Netflix. I think there's a Katie Keene show now, too, on the CW. I haven't seen that one. That's one of the other forgotten Archie franchises. But I gotta say, I know Andy's not a fan of Riverdale. I love the show. It's like over the top soap opera, but it's also, I recognize, incredibly divisive for a lot of Archie fans who just, for them, it's just those DeCarlo and Lucy comics from the early 1960s. That's the era that they love. But what I do love about Archie Comics is that you can, like, it's clay. You can just manipulate these characters and these ideas and do anything with them. So yes, Archie could be a caveman, or he could be a teenager, or it could be a zombie or a superhero, and it all makes sense because it doesn't make sense. Again, with Riverdale and the new Sabrina show, again, another example of Archie Comics finding a way to survive by, injecting these characters into other media.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, the one thing I was going to add to that is that, and Dan hits on a point that I think is really important and something that Bart Beatty points out. These characters exist for one reason: to serve the narrative, right? So any behavior they exhibit in one story will be completely contradicted in another if it will work for them for the gag or for the story. It's always high summer except when it needs to be winter. Archie's car is unreliable except, that's one of the things with these characters, their malleability and their ability to, their real purpose is to make money for who's ever publishing the comics, right? But, within the context of the worlds of the writers, they exist to serve a larger interest in narrative, and that's it.
Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about also the, Is there been any long form novels that are about the Archie universe, or has there been any any games that have been made? What else is, we talked about like the cartoons and the music? What other areas of pop culture references or marketing has the Archie publishers gone into?
Jelly jars.
Yeah, jelly jars. I just got an Archie blanket in the mail last week. So reprints the cover of Life with Archie #2, the famous milkshake cover. I love the jelly jars. Andy, do you have any of the jelly jars?
Man, I got a tragic jelly jar story, but yeah, and I've got doubles of jelly jars, Dan. So I've got a jelly jar for you.
Okay, great.
But I found a beautiful one. It was just excellent. I think even Sabrina may have been on it. It was a party scene. I bought it at the antique store in Queechee.
Yep.
They wrapped it carefully. I got home. I set it on its side on my chaotic kitchen table, and I watched it.
Oh.
So the disaster was entirely contained to the well-wrapped. So, but yeah. But this is the thing. Talk about longevity and the presence of Archie. Like, those glasses outlasted the TV show. I would go to my cousin's house, and my aunt would offer me a glass of milk in one of the old Archie Welch's jam jar glasses. And there'd be freaking hot dog and Jughead and the jalopy on it. So like this material culture persisted in ways that the association, the more ephemeral content of like the TV shows and stuff couldn't.
So for our listeners and for listeners and viewers out there who are said, you know what, all right, Andy and Dan, you sold me on it. I want to start collecting Archies. Where would you have the beginner collector? What would be the first direction you give the beginner collector? What would they need? What would they need to start their Archie collection?
I would say Archie for the past couple of years has been doing this nice little reprint series. I think there's 6x9 size, color, $9 or $10 a pop for like 200 pages, and it'll reprint 9 or 10 issues of Life with Archie from the 1960s. So there's probably about a dozen of those different titles. Any of those is a good place to start, especially the ones that reprint the 1960s material, like the Life with Archie title, or a couple of years ago, IDW had some best of hardcovers focused around Dan DeCarlo and Harry Lucy and Sam Schwartz and others. If you can find those are great dives. What's I constantly am frustrated with Archie Comics is that they're sitting on 80 years of reprintable material, yet they seem to just simply reprint the same 24 stories over and over again. And there's so much material out there that unless you want to pay 50 or $100 for a back issue or read it digitally, it's just pretty much impossible.
Yeah, and I'll second the IDWs, and the DeCarlos are still in print, at least in paperback, or some of them are, right?
Some of them are.
Yeah, they get expensive on the aftermarket. That's the problem with those. But
yeah. I mean, it's actually if you want, there's the back in 2015, Archie Comics relaunched the Archie title with Mark Waid writing it. It wasn't a cartoony thing anymore. It was very serious. Again, one of those divisive moments for a lot of Archie fans. They simply hate the new stuff. I think it's okay. Some folks might like it. You can check that out. But honestly, there's a lot of really fun Archie comics. Like if you can go get that Archie versus Predator comic, which you should do very soon because Marvel just got the rights for Predator again, so they're never going to reprint Archie versus Predator again, probably. Get a hold of that comic. It's a lot of fun. It's incredibly gory. And things like that. You can find some really fun, one-shots. I was also a big fan a couple years ago, the Archie Meets the Ramones.
That's fun.
Comic, yeah,
that's fun. And Dan, you subscribe to the Archie app, right?
Yeah. The Archie app is like $8 a month, and I'm reading Archie comics from the 1950s. They're not great scans, but there's no other way I can read these comics.
Yeah, and then Archie published, I think in the 80s or 90s, what they called the Americana series, which tend to be less expensive reprints, and they're by decade. So there's like the Archie in the 40s, Archie in the 50s, Archie in the 60s one is the elusive one for me. I just haven't found it cheap somewhere yet.
So are you feeling, are you guys, are the two of you noticing that the Archie collectible market is actually getting a little bit more crowded because of the Riverdale show and because of the re-release of Sabrina?
Yeah, I would say, we probably started collecting just at the end, before things started getting expensive again. Because I think, so within Archie collecting, everyone wants the 12 centers. And those were the era of Archie where the cover price was 12 cents. And that was also the era that DeCarlo and Lucy, et cetera, were all working for him. So it's the best era of Archie. You used to be able to find those for $1 or $2. I think a couple of years ago when we first started collecting, those are going up very quickly. They're in high demand. The other trend within that I find bizarre, dealers and collectors want these like risque, Betty and Veronica covers, or ones with double entendres on the cover. Like I just had to pay, I think it was 25 or $30 for a copy of Betty and Me number 16, which should have been a $2 book. But because there's, double entendre, a sexual double entendre on the cover, collectors have deemed this one as more valuable. So there's several books like that, which is a little frustrating.
Yeah, viewers and listeners, just Google Betty and Me 16 and you'll find the image. Oh God, I forgot what I was going to say. We'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Go look for Betty and Me.
Oh, what I was going to say is even low-grade copies are getting expensive. Particularly online. Like you can still, if you have a dealer, you can stumble in and there'll be stuff you can buy. That's usually a little different. And the other thing is like some of the absurdities, and these are the absurdities of old comic collecting in general right now. Not even risque covers, but like dealers will sort of spotlight bikini covers, which is like every other cover. Of an Archie comic as particularly desirable or therefore worth more attention or a higher price.
All right. Well, so guys, we're knocking at that. This has been pretty much an hour already. So real quick, so just give us some, where can people find you? If people want to learn more about, want to talk more with you, where can people find you?
I don't know if I want to talk to people.
At midnight on a full moon.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you mentioned before that Panel to Panel. Is that a group that you guys will talk a lot about Archies and?
Yeah,
No, but yeah, there are like 4 of us now. It irritates other people in the group. Yeah, so panel to panel, P2P, panel to panel on Facebook, and cover to cover, a panel to panel offshoot group, are one of the places where Dan and I hang around a lot on Facebook. Being middle-aged guys, that's where we rock on the Facebook. But yeah. We do also the Swap Thing event, which was canceled this year because of the pandemic. That's going to come back eventually, and we'll announce that. I don't know.
And that's here in Vermont. And
yeah, that's a comic sale and swap event in Essex, Vermont, at Memorial Hall, probably for the foreseeable future, because it's the only space that costs us next to nothing. So the event can be free.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Which means Dan and I get to dig through boxes of Archie comics. And I think this is, as a sign off, Barney opened by referencing the Swap Thing event where, Dan and I were feverishly looking for Archies. And that was the one where I believe Fanboy Comics had their miscut copy of Betty and Me #2.
It was Betty and Me #1.
#1, and we both looked at it and we were both like, do we buy? And neither of us bought it.
We didn't buy it. And I end up getting a reader copy for less than $10. So
yeah, and I think that's a better deal.
Yeah. So I think we should end on, a Team Betty or Team Veronica, right? The classic question.
It's so hard. You start, Dan. Team Betty or Team Veronica?
I'm on Team Veronica. I know, and I think that the love triangle there, it's really one of those, like, the grass is always greener on the other side. And, but I think, Archie is just attracted to someone who's going to hurt him. And that's why he deserves to have Veronica.
Well, and the thing I'll preface mine with is something that Andrew Rash said, pointed out, is like, essentially, Veronica is Archie's girlfriend and Betty's a crazy stalker. And there is something to that. The Betty Veronica dichotomy is also the Ginger Marianne dichotomy, just cast over something slightly different. I break Team Betty, but with all the caveats that, like, Betty's kind of a mess. It's like, if anything, I have empathy for Betty, and I want to help Betty get better and find someone who's going to treat her right. And that's not me. I'm not that guy, but, so I'm Team Betty, but qualified, that I think, if anything, the 3 of them deserve each other.
Yes. Yeah. Barney?
I've always been, I'm Team Veronica. Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andy and Dan. And we will look forward to, maybe we can have you guys back on later, and some later when we want to talk about, more seasons of Riverdale or something.
Or talk about horror comics. Talk about Archie horror comics.
Archie horror, yeah.
Archie horror 70s and aughts. Okay, thank you very much, Barney. And thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Right. So you guys are familiar. You guys must have been you Zoom all the time then for your work as well.
God, I'm so sick of it.
Unfortunately, yes. Like, yeah. I'm actually enthusiastic to talk to people on the phone now.